And that gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Eric Sapirstein of ENS Resources, which is a member of the Bay Planning Coalition, has been representing our interests in Washington, D.C. for over a year. If you look at our website, whenever Congress is in session, we get a weekly update on all the activity, both on Congress as well as the regulatory agencies that his company, ENS Resources, puts together and is posted on our website. Eric does a phenomenal job helping us, and I would encourage if you need assistance in DC, this company is the one to talk to. Eric is going to give us an update on what is happening, or for that matter, not happening in Washington. That's probably a better way to describe it. And with that, I'd like to introduce Eric Sapirstein.
Thank you, John, for that warm welcome. It's great to be here. We have dual problems here. The light on the PowerPoint, and we're going back sort of to the evolution of PowerPoints and what have you. I have Amanda, who's going to function as my Carol Merrill today, and she's going to push the slides for me. So, before I start, how many people, I show of hands, how many people think Washington's going to do anything in the next 6 months, or the next 5 months? Not even one person? Oh, good, one person, thank you. You're wrong. But because this is a decision-makers conference, I thought, let's go over what the decision-makers in Washington are going to do and not going to do. And it's not all doom and gloom. Amanda, what I've said is, it's a brave new frontier. And the reason will become obvious as we go through these slides. First, I want to touch on the general political climate. And then I want to talk about some specific areas of importance that I believe will be valuable for you to hear about. In many respects, though, it is a great new time. And within the context of the general political climate, you will begin to see why it's a great new time. Let me turn now to the specific issues that you see up here. Okay, so, first of all, I like to call Washington a tea kettle atmosphere right at this point in time. Tea kettle because the pressure is huge to get things done and nothing get done. We all know why. But that pressure keeps building and building. And one of the reasons we can't get things done is because of social media. It isn't just related to the Arab Spring or in Europe. Anything that gets done in Washington, the stakeholder communities broadcast it and they put pressure on the legislators to stop or at least modify the efforts that are underway. You saw that with the cybersecurity legislation this week. You saw it previously in other cyber legislation. Legislation was supposed to absolutely sail through, just stopped dead in its tracks. So that atmosphere, pressure keeps building. Then we've got the tax and spending implications. And I'm going to get to that in the budget discussion, but I think you can guess what those are. It's essentially no more new taxes and cut spending. And then you've got the big congressional approval. You can't see it in this chart very well because of the light, but 2 months ago, congressional approval by the public was at 11%, the lowest ever. It's risen to about 17% right now. What you have is a public at large, very dubious at the best of times about what Congress can do. And at the worst of times, throw the bums out. And I think that's really what we may be headed towards in this election cycle. And finally, you've got the campaign factors. Nothing in an environment like we are in today is helped by the fact that it's an election year. So, when you think about what we're going to talk about on some substantive issues today, keep in mind these 4 factors, because they are going to influence what happens after the November elections. So the policy issues of the moment that are directly value, I think, to you folks to learn about. First of all, Resources Development Act, let's say slash the grant back, because that's very important to you and after the last presentation. It's clear there's a lot going on in that area. Ballast water discharge standards, a huge issue, one of the areas where we are going to see some kind of activity. Infrastructure financing in general and specifically the ports. And then, of course, the budget. So on the Water Resources Development Act, everybody knows that we can't get earmarks. for spending in Congress. What sometimes is lost outside the Beltway of Washington is you can't get earmarks for authorizations of projects either. So the earmark ban precludes option in Congress to push a Water Resources Development Act and thereby dredging projects and related activities. So what we're probably going to see, if there's any hope for a Water Resources Development Act bill taking place in the next couple of months or during a lame duck session, is a policy bill. And by policy bill, I mean issues like limiting mission creep at the Corps of Engineers. So get the Corps to focus on the core issues. Second is regulatory reform. Everybody knows about how we define waters in the United States under the Clean Water Act. Even though EPA has sent a revised regulation or policy guidance document to the Office of Management Budget for final approval and publication, members of Congress are continuing the effort to overturn what the EPA is trying to do and go back to the definition of waters in the United States prior to the Supreme Court decision that we're all familiar with that has created the problems that we face today, uncertainty. And finally, I think when you look at WRDA, the whole debate over new starts and whether we can put more projects on the drawing board for future planning activities and actual construction. There is an overwhelming interest on the administration's part to limit new starts because of the concern that it will expose the federal government to increasing spending commitments and revenues. So from a WRDA standpoint, if we see anything happening, it's going to be a policy bill. And maybe just maybe a few couple favored projects, but I'm real dubious on that happening. Okay, so the transportation bill. I wish you could see some of these slides. But what this slide shows here is the maritime highways that were part of the effort of the transportation bill to sort of reinvigorate, if you will, the whole efforts to boost maritime activities and economic development. And I think what you need to understand, when you look at Tiger grants, when you look at intermodal priorities of the transportation bill, when you look at maritime corridors, it's all about figuring out ways to get money into the port activities. We are through, I think, in Washington, to a large degree because of budget issues, discrete program funding activities. It will be incumbent upon each of you who has interest in developing projects to look for collaborative, or shall we say, collective approaches to funding projects with different mechanisms. I can't emphasize that enough. Tiger grants, if this administration is reelected and they put a new transportation bill together and they lame duck session, it probably won't happen in the next 3 months. I can see the Tiger grants are going to be reinforced and put back strongly as a mechanism to get money out there for big projects that are intermodal and hold the promise of jump-starting the economic activities of the region. Let me turn very briefly to the RAMP Act, Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. How many people are encouraged, or do you know, that the trust fund language that is in the House bill, in the transportation bill specifically, tells basically the appropriators to spend all the money into the trust fund in a given year? It's available. Are you aware of that? Okay. That's the good news. The bad news is that in the course of the language getting put into the House Transportation Bill, they dropped some provisions that allowed the points of order to be waived. That's inside the relevant stuff. What that means is you don't have the ability to short-circuit the appropriations committee. So the final analysis, what's going on is we have this nice directive that the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund be spent year in and year out totally, but they forgot to give a sort of get out of jail card for that to be forced on the appropriators. So it's business as usual right now. There's no change. And I think, you know, if you look at what's going on, the appropriators on the House side essentially provided for FY13 this past week about $1 billion. Now it's an increase over the current year's spending for the trust fund. But you're still looking at less money than being appropriated than what is available. Like, you know, if you can push it again, kind of. Really can't see it. But this chart shows that the trust fund, which is that, you can see that upper line going up. That's the estimated number of dollars that are growing in the trust fund to the year 2015. And then those other lines show the kind of federal expenditures in the current law for dredging. So you can see what's happening. The dollars are going to the trust fund, and the activities for dredging are basically staying constant. So without a sincere, real strong push to change this dynamic, we're going to have business as usual. We're just going to see $1 billion, give or take a few $100 million, appropriated any given year, because the appropriators and the budget folks in Congress don't want to increase the federal deficit. They want to decrease. And the trust fund, obviously, is a huge way, and all trust funds at the federal level are a huge way to increase the budget deficit. Okay, so even though nothing is really happening, there is one area where something is happening, and that's the ballast water standards and control standards for invasive species. Coast Guard in March issued its final rule for technologies for controls of invasive species. EPA is set to issue in November of this year, a year ahead of schedule, numeric standards enforceable under the Clean Water Act to control for invasive species. And we expect that that final, what I refer to as a vessel general permit that will be issued in November, will be litigated by the stakeholder community as not being stringent enough. So essentially, we're going to see standards by the Coast Guard put out on the street, effective. And currently, right now, will be effective for ships that are being built today. And then there'll be a phase-in approach over the next couple of years for existing ships to install controls. And then we'll have litigation to see if the standards actually on the EPA side are more stringent than what is expected to come out, or need to become even more stringent in what position. So I think what you're going to see is essentially a program monitored and administered by the Coast Guard, a real open question about what kind of permits ship operators should operate under from the EPA standpoint. Finally, as far as policy issues are concerned, infrastructure. Let me suggest to you that we are in a paradigm shift. The debate no longer is how much money is available. The debate in Washington is over how to finance what's needs. Whether it's options on trust funds, tiger grants, WIFIA as a corollary to TIFIA, which is essentially a loan guarantee or a low-interest loan program to support water-related project activities. Infrastructure bank is something the administration is trying to do. Think about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, like the implosion of the housing industry, as a way to finance an innovative approach through grants, loans, and hybrids, those two activities. And finally, private activity bonds, probably one of the right areas of opportunities. Right now, there's language in the transportation bill again that will essentially lift the state volume cap for water and wastewater infrastructure projects that are developed by the private sector as public-private partnerships, whether it's for ports, whether it's for water treatment, whether it's for wastewater. If that gets enacted into law, and there's a strong possibility it will with the transportation bill, that will mean essentially that there will be unrestrained ability to finance projects with these private activity bonds at the state level, lifting the state volume cap that is already in place. That's essentially pencils out to about $90 million of spending authority per person in the state fund doing the volume cap. So, what I want to leave you with is the fact that it's all about financing instruments. And the message that we've been saying in Washington, folks, is we don't have a preferred choice. We just want to have as many tools in the toolbox to address the needs. Because if we don't have that, there's absolutely no way to address all those federal mandates at the local and state level when it comes to water or transportation in between those two extremes. And finally, that's a picture of a tsunami. I call it the budgetary disaster that's coming. So when nothing is going on, what forces action? Well, crisis mentality. So here's the deal. When I think Obama was referring to Congress, or all of the Secret Service, he referred to those knuckleheads when they failed to come up with a budget agreement for FY 2013 and super committee efforts for the next 10 years to reduce the budget deficit and then get us on a pathway to reduce the overall debt of the country. What happened was that there are spending cuts triggered automatically for each of the next 10 years. There are $55 billion annually for domestic spending and $55 billion for military spending. That's each year. That's a lot of money. And look, here's the other bad news. It doesn't hit all domestic programs equally. The Corps of Engineers could be hit more so than, say, housing and urban development. It's up to the president. Congress gave the president unbelievable discretionary authority to decide where to put those cuts, as long as it came up to $55 billion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the continuing resolution. We're not going to have a budget until after November 6th. So we're going to fight this fight for the next 3-4 months, and we're going to fund the government for the next couple of months. Then we've got tax rates. Bush tax rates, the Obama payroll tax cut, state tax, adjustments in the alternative minimum tax, all those expire on or around December 31st. And then if that's not enough, you've got the debt ceiling increasing. Those of you remember what happened last August when Congress did hit its all-time low of 11% in approval. The debt ceiling limit was the reason for it. They couldn't figure out how to raise the debt limit and then allow the federal government and Treasury to print money to pay the debt. Well, that's going to be due sometime in December, maybe January or February of 2013. So that's forcing the crisis mentality. And then health care. Well, that may not be of direct interest to you from a port management standpoint. If the Supreme Court decides this is expected to rule that it is unconstitutional, then they've got another problem on their hands, because now they've got to figure out how to put this mess back together again. It's a little bit like a Rubik's Cube, the policy level. So you've got all these factors, and you've got the president, if he's reelected, holding all the cards. The Congress holds nothing but jokers. Because the president does nothing. He gets his wish. He gets the money in Congress. The federal deficit declines overnight from 7.5% of gross domestic product to 1.3% overnight. I mean, it's an amazing occurrence that we're having. It also causes incredible economic catastrophe. So what you see is, after November 6th, there's going to be a rain coming. And all the things that we're talking about before this budgetary disaster scenario could become part of what I call the mother of all lame duck concessions. Because, remember, there's no earmarks. But these men and women in Congress are going to have to come back to the table and figure out a way to trade opportunities and policy needs. And whether they call them earmarks, they call them facts of life, we've got to cut a deal. I think between November 6th and December 31st, we're going to try and shoehorn in probably 2 years of congressional activity into about 45 days of legislative activity. And when that happens, you're going to get calls from whoever you work with in Washington or at the state level and say, you've got to help us, and they have the message out. Because whether it's WRDA, whether it's tax policy issues that impact ports and waterways, all these things could conceivably be on the table. So, John, I'm going to end there and just end and say it's not as negative as it seems. I view it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity. You know, you never know what's going to happen. And if, in fact, the president loses and the Senate goes Republican and the House stays Republican, then you have a problem, because there's no incentive for anyone to negotiate. At that point, you start putting your money under the mattress or dealing gold, because you have a real problem, because you will have to that. But bottom line is there will be opportunities for things. And I do believe that the infrastructure issue in and of itself ends up being perhaps the most powerful message to members of Congress, because it creates the government activity. So John, down with this one.
Thank you. Are there any questions from Blue Cards? Blue Cards back there. While the Blue Card is being picked up, and I apologize for the noise, I'm not sure what they're doing out there. Maybe they're fixing a fire hydrant they knocked over earlier with the truck. Who knows? Well, we're in a port, so that's why you have noise. My question to you, Eric, is why did the Republicans, i.e. the Tea Party, give up all authority, spending authority, to the president by getting rid of earmarks? Is that going to be reversed?
So the sort of humorous way to phrase it is it's a little bit like nuclear discussions. Unilateral disarmament is not a good thing. The Tea Party represents about 20% of the voting public, but they represent a core majority within the House Republican Leadership Conference. So they gave it up because it was a good soundbite. They thought it was a way to end federal spending and essentially force, shall we call it, a devolution of responsibilities to state and local government. It purely is an ideological view of the world. But it is unilateral disarmament because now they have nothing to negotiate with the president. That's why you don't have a deal on the transportation bill. That's why Werner is hung up in both committees. Because these are pieces of legislation or federal policy that demand project authorizations. We can't do it, so there's no motivation to pass it. So, what role do you see public-private partnerships what role does the ability to do public-private partnerships sort of take over and enhance the infrastructure debate in general? I think the answer to that question is it's going to become increasingly important. Europe does public-private partnerships. We don't do public-private partnerships because of political considerations. I think the way to answer this question is it's incumbent upon public officials to have the right mix of professional talent to go toe-to-toe with the private sector that is seeking to do a public-private partnership. Because if you don't have the right personalities at the table negotiating a deal, you are going to get stuck. So I think P3s are going to grow as an important mechanism to close the funding gap that the federal government, state governments, and local governments can't meet. But I think you're going to see, it's a pendulum. We will return to, I think, an aggressive public commitment of dollars. It's just as I said, it's the financing mechanisms, it's not funding money.
Another question, you had mentioned that the House Transportation basically neutered the RAMP Act. Can it be fixed in another committee to make sure that that money goes to the Corps to do the job that they need to do? Because the committee to doing the work, they just don't have the resources to do it. Can it be fixed?
You know, I'm somewhat pessimistic because the last time something like the RAMP Act was successfully achieved was when a guy named Bud Schuster was chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee back in the 80s and early 90s. And he took the transportation funding bill off budget and required that the money be spent, much like the RAMP Act provisions. He stacked his committee to about 75 to 76 members of the House of Representatives, and it was because of that overwhelming number they could get it through. Since that time, the committee structure has been redesigned. They've scaled back the number of members, and the appropriators learned an important lesson. They never let their guard down. So I think it's going to be very difficult to get past the appropriators, shall we say, desires to control how the money is spent. But you never know. I mean, I was talking to Isaac, and I said, you know, one massive infrastructure disaster at an American port, and you're going to see these guys running all over the place trying to explain why we have to use all the money in the trust fund.
I'll ask one final question, unless there's another blue card out there. Assume that the president is reelected, the House remains Republican, the Senate remains Democrat. Does that mean we have 4 more years of status quo?
I don't think so. I truly think that what you're going to see, well, let's put it this way. You folks in California set the stage for us to do what we're doing today. It's all your fault. You imposed term limits, and now we have effectively term limits because of the Tea Party and the disgust with the way Congress in Washington works. After this election, consider this. In the House of Representatives, the average tenure of a member of Congress will be less than 6 years. If you take Henry Waxman and Pete Stark out of it, it's about 2 years. So, I mean, you're basically looking at a very new breed of politician. And I think that they're going to be saying, hey, we've got to do something. We're new, we want to rewrite the way government works. And I think they're going to realize that after a while, it does no good just to have gridlock. That's in the House. In the Senate, because you have a filibuster, it's problematic. If the House and the Senate go Republican, as far as majority control is concerned, I think you will see something happen if Obama is reelected. Because I think they're going to say, all of us have to look better. And so there's a motivating factor to come to some agreement. And keep in mind, Obama's not a liberal. And you look at his votes, the votes he's taken when he was in the Senate, and look at what he's doing on a programmatic basis as president of the administration, he's basically moderate to left. He's not way to left. So I think there's a good chance that we won't have gridlock.
Eric, thank you very much for coming out to Washington.